My name is Ava, and for most of my life I believed that family loyalty was unbreakable, and that the people who raised me would never turn their backs on me. But that belief shattered the day my parents stood in my doorway and told me to pack my things because the house was no longer mine but my sister's. I stood frozen in the living room that I had built with my own hands using savings that took years of long shifts, double jobs, and nights where I barely slept. The walls around me still held the memories of everything I had fought for, yet my parents acted like those years never existed, as if the sacrifices I made were some kind of illusion. My father looked at me with a strange coldness, as if I had somehow become a stranger instead of his daughter, and my mother kept her eyes lowered, refusing to meet mine. They spoke to me with a tone that felt rehearsed, almost like they had planned this moment for months, and now I was expected to step aside silently while my younger sister walked in as if she had earned the right to claim what I had built. I asked them why they were doing this, and my mother said that my sister needed stability, and that her future mattered more because she was the fragile one, the one who needed protection, the one who deserved comfort. The words hit me like a storm because I had heard that excuse my whole life. My sister was always treated like she was made of glass, delicate, precious, untouchable, while I was expected to carry responsibilities without complaint. When I graduated, when I worked 2 jobs, when I bought this house, they praised me only when it benefited them, and now that the house was finally something of value, they saw it as a gift they could hand over to someone else. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to understand how the people who once told me they were proud could now discard me so easily. My sister entered through the front door without knocking, and she wore a smug smile that made my stomach twist. She looked around the living room like she was inspecting something she had already claimed. She said that it was better this way because she was planning her future and needed space, and she expected me to understand. The casual tone of her voice felt like a slap to my face. This was my home, my safe place, the only thing in my life that I had full control over, and she wanted it simply because she thought she deserved it. My parents stood beside her almost like a united front, and in that moment I realized that I was completely alone. Not one of them asked how I felt or what I needed. Not one of them cared that I was being pushed out of a life I built from nothing. I walked to my room trying to steady my breathing while my mind spiraled with disbelief. The bed, the shelves, the small victories displayed in this room were pieces of a journey they had never acknowledged, yet they believed they had the right to decide its fate. I opened a drawer and pulled out the thick folder I had kept since the day I started saving for this house. Inside were every mortgage paper, every bank statement, every letter from the lender. I held the folder close, feeling the weight of years inside my hands. This was the proof that no matter what they claimed, the truth was mine. I bought this house. I paid every bill. I carried every burden. I owned it. I breathed deeply and stepped back into the living room where they were already discussing where my sister would put her furniture. It was like they expected me to vanish quietly. I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it slowly, letting each page speak for me since my voice felt too unsteady to carry the truth. I told them that the house was mine by law, by payment, by sweat, and that I had every receipt to prove it. My sister stopped talking and stared at the papers with wide disbelief while my parents shifted uncomfortably like they had not expected me to fight back. My father said that ownership did not matter because family decisions were more important and that I should be willing to sacrifice for the good of my sister. His words cut deeper than anything else. To him, my hard work was worthless. To him, the law meant nothing. To him, my life was something he could rearrange at will. I looked at them all with a pain I could barely hold inside. I told them that this was the last time they would decide my life for me. I told them that the girl who once tried to earn their approval was gone. They did not expect me to stand firm. They never expected me to challenge the dynamic that kept me silent for years. But I stood there with the truth in my hands, and for the first time in my life they had no power over me. My sister tried to argue, but the law is not based on favoritism, and she knew it. Her voice cracked as she realized she was not entitled to what she assumed would be handed to her. My parents looked at me like I had betrayed them, yet they were the ones who tried to take everything from me. The silence that followed was heavy and painful, and it was the kind that changes a family forever. I told them they needed to leave my house because this was no longer a conversation but a boundary. My sister stormed out, first furious that her plans had fallen apart. My mother hesitated at the doorway, her face breaking into a mix of guilt and disbelief, as if she could not understand why I was choosing myself for the first time. My father walked out without a word, his disappointment radiating toward me like a final punishment. When the door closed, I felt a grief deeper than anything I had ever known, yet beneath that grief was a strength that had waited years to rise. I sank onto the couch, breathing slowly as the quiet of my home wrapped around me. It was painful, but it was real and it was mine. I sat in the silence of my living room, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me, because even though I had won the battle to keep my home, it did not feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something I spent my whole life building, only to discover that the foundation was never as strong as I believed. I never imagined that the people I loved the most could walk away from me so easily, all because I refused to give up the one thing that represented my independence and my worth. I kept replaying their expressions in my mind: the coldness, the shock, the disappointment, and most of all, the complete lack of concern for how their decision would destroy me. I kept thinking about all the birthdays, all the holidays, all the times I showed up for them without question, and how none of that mattered when they decided that my sister deserved more. It was a painful truth to confront, the kind that sinks into your bones and forces you to see everything clearly for the first time. When the sun finally set outside the windows, I realized how exhausted I was, yet I could not sleep. My heart felt heavy and my head was a swirl of what ifs. What if I had agreed to leave? Would they have even cared where I ended up? What if I had stayed quiet? Would my sister have taken every room, every corner, every part of the house without acknowledging how much I sacrificed? What if I never found the strength to stand up for myself? The thought made my chest tighten, because for the first time I understood how deeply I had been conditioned to put myself last, and how easily I could have surrendered everything if I had allowed my fear of losing them to control me. That realization scared me more than anything else. I knew in that moment that something inside me had shifted forever, and that I could never go back to being the person who stayed silent for the sake of keeping the peace. The next morning I woke up with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. I walked through each room of the house slowly, as if I needed to reclaim it piece by piece. The kitchen where I had cooked meals after long shifts, the hallway where I had dropped my bag after 15-hour days, the bedroom where I had cried through setbacks, but also celebrated small victories. Every corner held a memory that belonged to me alone, not to my parents, not to my sister. Yet I could still feel their presence lingering like a shadow, and that made my chest ache. I told myself that I needed to breathe, that I needed to focus on moving forward, but the pain of their betrayal clung to me like a second skin. It was not just about the house. It was about every moment in my life where I had been expected to be strong while they protected my sister, as if she were a fragile jewel they could not allow to crack. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching cars pass by on the street. For the first time I understood what loneliness really felt like. It was not the absence of people. It was the realization that the people you love most never truly saw you. They saw the version of you that was useful to them, the version that made life easier, the version that never asked for anything in return. I wondered if my parents were sitting somewhere convincing themselves they had done the right thing. I wondered if my sister felt even a hint of remorse, or if she was still angry that she could not take something she never earned. The thought made my heart tighten, but at the same time it sparked a new strength in me. Maybe losing them was not the tragedy I thought it was. Maybe it was the beginning of a life where I would finally put myself first. Later that afternoon my phone buzzed again and again, but I could not bring myself to look at the screen. I knew it was them. I knew they would try to twist the situation into something that made me look ungrateful or selfish. They had always been good at reshaping the truth in ways that made them comfortable. When I finally picked up the phone and saw dozens of missed calls and messages, I felt a wave of numbness wash over me. Some were from my mother insisting that we needed to talk. Some were from my father telling me I was being dramatic. Some were from my sister accusing me of ruining her life. The messages blurred together into one painful reminder that they were only reaching out to fix the situation they created, not to understand how deeply they had hurt me. I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the table, because I knew that any conversation right now would only tear the wound open wider. I needed time. I needed space. I needed to breathe without feeling like I owed them an explanation for choosing myself. That evening, as I sat on my bed staring at the ceiling, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would rebuild my life piece by piece, even if I had to start completely alone. I would create boundaries that protected me instead of breaking me. I would stop fighting for people who never lifted a finger for me. And most of all, I would never again allow anyone to make me feel guilty for owning what I earned. The days that followed were a strange mix of peace and heartbreak. Some moments felt strangely freeing, as if I had stepped out of a cage I did not know I was trapped in. Other moments felt heavy, like grief was sitting in my chest, refusing to move. I started focusing on work, pushing myself into long hours and new projects because the distraction helped. But at night, when everything grew quiet, the memories returned, reminding me that I had not only lost a house conflict, I had lost the illusion of a family that valued me. As the weeks passed, I began to realize that healing was not a straight line but a maze of unexpected turns. Some days I woke up feeling stronger, ready to face whatever came my way, and ready to keep building a life that finally centered around my own needs. Other days I felt like the weight of everything I had been through was pulling me under. I would find myself staring at the walls of my living room, remembering the echo of their voices telling me to leave, as if I were some intruder in my own home. The memory of that moment still hit me with quiet force, and I would feel tears gathering before I could stop them. I tried to remind myself that choosing myself was not selfish but necessary, yet the ache of losing the people I had once trusted most never fully faded. It sat inside me like a bruise I kept pressing without meaning to. One evening I sat outside on the front porch, watching the sky darken over the neighborhood. The warm air brushed against my skin, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe deeply without thinking about anything else. The porch had always been a place where I sat after long days, letting the quiet settle around me. Yet even this space felt different now, because it was no longer tied to the idea of family safety or belonging. It was tied to something heavier, something more personal. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be the dependable daughter, the responsible one, the one who made sacrifices without expecting anything in return. I thought about how many times I had given my parents money when they needed it, how many times I had rearranged my life to help my sister through her endless crises. And still they had looked at me with empty eyes the day they told me to leave. That realization carved a hollow feeling in my chest, because it proved that loving them had never been enough to make them love me back in the same way. I tried reaching out to a few close friends, hoping their voices might help fill the emptiness I carried, but I found myself pulling back every time. Not because they did anything wrong, but because explaining the truth felt unbearable. How could I put into words that my parents had tried to hand my house to someone else as if my hard work meant nothing? How could I explain the kind of betrayal that makes you question your own worth? Whenever someone asked if I was okay, I gave a small nod and said I was managing, because it was easier than admitting how deeply I was hurting. At night I would lie awake, staring into the dark and wondering when the pain would loosen its grip. I wondered if there would ever be a moment where I could think about my family without feeling like I had been struck in the chest. Eventually I forced myself to turn my phone back on, though part of me dreaded what I would find. When the screen lit up with dozens of unread messages, I felt the familiar sting of disappointment. None of the messages were apologies. They were demands, requests, and attempts to guilt me into returning to the role I had always played. My mother wrote that families go through tough times and that I should be the bigger person. My father sent a short message saying that I was making things harder than they needed to be. My sister sent long blocks of text claiming I was heartless for refusing to help her, even though helping her had always meant sacrificing myself. I read each message slowly, letting the truth sink in deeper. They did not see me. They did not understand me. They did not value me unless I was giving them something. And I knew in that moment that reconnecting with them would only reopen wounds I was trying to heal. I powered off the phone again and placed it gently on the table, like something delicate that might shatter if I held it any longer. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and clarity. Their words no longer surprised me, because I finally understood that their love came with conditions. I had spent my entire life trying to meet those conditions, hoping that one day they would see me as worthy. But I knew now that their version of love was not something I wanted anymore. I wanted peace. I wanted honesty. I wanted people in my life who did not take advantage of my kindness or see me as an endless resource. I wanted to rebuild myself without carrying the weight of their expectations. It was a painful truth, but it was also a freeing one. As time moved forward, I began to pour my energy into making the house feel like home again. I bought new furniture piece by piece, decorating each room in a style that reflected who I was rather than the version of myself I had tried to be for my family. I painted the walls in warm, earthy tones that made the space feel grounded and safe. I replaced old pictures with new artwork that spoke to strength, resilience, and transformation. Every change, no matter how small, felt like a small step toward reclaiming my identity. It was slow and emotional work, but with each day I felt something inside me settle just a little more. The house finally began to feel like mine again, not because I had owned it financially, but because I was rebuilding it emotionally, piece by piece. One night as I sat on the couch with a soft blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I realized something I had never allowed myself to admit before. I was proud of myself. Proud that I stood up for what was mine. Proud that I broke a cycle that had been weighing me down for years. Proud that I refused to let anyone take away what I earned. The pain was still there, but behind it was a strength I had never seen in myself until now. I whispered into the quiet room that I was going to be okay, even if I had to build this new life from the ground up. And for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it. As the months continued to pass, I found myself slowly growing into a version of me that I had never been allowed to become before. There was a quiet confidence forming in my chest, a steady awareness that I no longer needed to earn love through sacrifice or prove my worth through endless giving. I spent more time alone, not because I was avoiding the world, but because I was finally learning how to listen to my own heart, without the noise of other people's expectations drowning it out. Some evenings I would sit on the floor of the living room with soft music playing in the background, and I would look around at the home I had fought so hard to keep. It no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a safe place, a beginning, a promise that I would never again let anyone make me feel like I did not deserve the life I built. Yet even as I grew stronger, the pain still found ways to rise at unexpected moments. Sometimes while making dinner, I would remember how my mother used to criticize everything I did, no matter how hard I tried to meet her standards. Sometimes while folding laundry, I would remember how my father rarely looked at me with pride unless I was achieving something that made the family look good. And sometimes when I walked past the second bedroom, I would remember my sister standing in the doorway the day she assumed she would be moving her things into my home, as if it belonged to her by birthright. Those memories came like sudden waves, pulling me backward for just a moment before I managed to steady myself again. Healing was not forgetting. Healing was learning to face the memories without letting them break me. One afternoon I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from my parents' church asking for donations for a community event. I stared at the letter for a long moment, feeling a mix of bitterness and sadness. For years I had given money to support their events because my parents asked me to, because they said it mattered to them, because they told me it was my responsibility to help. And now I wondered if they had told the church some twisted version of the story that painted me as ungrateful or difficult. The thought made my throat tighten because it reminded me that people often rewrite the truth to protect their own ego, and my parents had always been good at rewriting stories in ways that kept them innocent. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, deciding that this was one more chapter one needed to close. There were moments when I questioned my decision to keep my distance. I would see families together at parks or restaurants laughing and sharing memories, and I would feel a sharp ache in my chest. I wondered if I had made the right choice or if I had been too harsh or too stubborn. But every time I allowed myself to imagine going back to them, I remembered the day they told me to pack my things. I remembered the way they stood together, united not out of love but out of selfishness. I remembered the way they ignored my pain as if it were an inconvenience. And I knew then that staying away was not an act of anger. It was an act of survival. I could not grow in an environment that saw my strength as something to exploit. Over time I started opening myself up to new friendships. People who valued me without conditions. People who listened without judgment. People who did not take advantage of my kindness. It felt unfamiliar at first because I had spent so many years believing that love required sacrifice or silence. But as I got to know these people, I realized that healthy relationships do not drain you. They restore you. One friend invited me to a small gathering at her house, and I hesitated at first but eventually agreed. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt warm and genuine. People shared stories, laughed together, and spoke openly about their struggles. No one expected anything from me except for my presence. It felt strange and refreshing. I left that night with a soft warmth in my chest, a reminder that there were still good people in the world who valued connection without manipulation. I continued adding small changes to my home whenever I could. I planted flowers in the front yard, choosing bright, gentle colors that made the house feel welcoming. I added shelves filled with books that inspired growth and strength. I bought soft blankets, candles, and small decorations that made the rooms feel comforting. Every detail felt like a piece of my healing, shaping a future that finally belonged to me. I no longer felt the need to apologize for my choices. I no longer felt the need to explain myself. This house was mine not only by law but by the journey I walked to reclaim it emotionally. One night I sat on the porch again, watching the stars spread across the dark sky. The air felt cool against my skin and I wrapped my arms around myself as I took in the quiet of the evening. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who tried endlessly to be everything her family needed. I thought about how many years I spent shrinking myself to fit into their expectations. And then I thought about who I was becoming now. A woman who knew her worth. A woman who fought back. A woman who survived something she never expected to face. Tears filled my eyes, but this time they were not from pain. They were from pride. From relief. From the realization that losing them had allowed me to finally find myself. As the seasons changed, I felt the shift inside myself grow stronger, like the world was slowly aligning with my healing. The winter brought quiet mornings where the cold air brushed against the windows, and I would sit on the couch wrapped in a soft blanket listening to the hum of the heater, as if it were the heartbeat of the house itself. During those still hours, I often found myself reflecting on the life I once lived and the person I used to be. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped by the expectations of others, and how deeply I had absorbed the idea that I was only worthy when I was giving or sacrificing. It was a painful truth to confront, yet it was also a liberating one, because accepting it meant I could finally let it go. I could finally grow beyond the limitations that had been placed on me since childhood. I could finally rebuild a life rooted in my own choices rather than the demands of people who never truly saw me. There were moments when memories of my family still stung sharply. I would see something as simple as a mother and daughter sharing a laugh or a father helping his child with groceries, and the ache inside me would flare up with a fierce intensity. I would think about how different my life could have been if my parents had valued fairness or empathy or even basic respect. I would imagine a version of myself who grew up feeling supported instead of overlooked. These thoughts would wash over me like cold water, and I would feel the familiar heaviness pull at my heart. Yet after a few breaths the weight would ease, because I reminded myself that I was no longer trapped in those patterns. I was no longer waiting for their approval. I was no longer bending myself into shapes that made me feel small. I was learning to love myself in ways they never taught me. One afternoon I received a message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw my sister's name at the bottom of a short pleading paragraph saying she needed help with something urgent. My stomach twisted immediately. Even though the message was brief, it carried the same energy I had felt my entire life. The expectation that I would drop everything to fix her problems. The assumption that I would step in without hesitation. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling an old familiar guilt rising inside me. A guilt that had been planted in me from the time I was a child. A guilt that whispered I was responsible for her well-being even when she showed no gratitude. But then another voice inside me softly reminded me of the day she tried to claim my home as if it were hers. It reminded me of her mocking smile, her entitlement, her refusal to acknowledge my pain. And just like that, the guilt began to fade. I placed the phone on the table and stepped outside to breathe the cool air. I looked at the yard, the sidewalk, the quiet street around me. This was my life now. A life where I was allowed to set boundaries without feeling like I was betraying someone. A life where I could protect my heart without being called selfish. A life where my worth was not tied to how much I could give to people who only took. I realized then that answering her message would pull me back into a cycle I had fought so hard to escape. So I made a choice that once felt impossible. I did not reply. I walked back inside my home, feeling a mix of fear and strength wash through me. But beneath it all there was a deep sense of relief, because I knew I had done the right thing for myself. As spring arrived, the world outside grew louder with birds and leaves and warm breezes, and in a strange way it mirrored the growth happening inside me. I found myself opening the windows more often, letting fresh air fill the house. I cooked meals just for myself without rushing or stressing. I started journaling about my feelings, writing page after page of thoughts I had kept buried for years. Every word felt like a release, a piece of emotional debris I had been carrying on my shoulders for far too long. Some nights I cried as I wrote, and other nights I smiled softly at the strength I did not realize I had. The pages of my journal became a map of my healing, showing me how far I had traveled from the pain that once consumed me. There was one night when I lay in bed staring at the soft glow of the lamp on my nightstand, and I felt a calmness I had not experienced in years. It was the kind of calm that comes after a storm, when the air is still and everything feels possible again. I thought about the future, and for the first time it did not feel heavy or uncertain. It felt open. It felt hopeful. It felt like something I was allowed to shape without interference or judgment. I whispered to myself that I was proud of surviving something that would have broken a different version of me. I whispered that I deserved peace. I whispered that I was enough exactly as I was. And in that moment, lying in the quiet warmth of my room with the world outside softly humming, I realized that this was the beginning of a life I finally chose for myself. As the days continued to unfold into a quieter life, I began noticing small signs that I was changing in ways I never expected. I woke up earlier in the mornings not because I had to but because the world felt softer and calmer in those early hours. The sunlight streaming through my bedroom window no longer felt like a reminder of responsibilities or expectations. Instead, it felt like an invitation to breathe and exist without pressure. I would make myself a simple breakfast and sit at the dining table, listening to the gentle hum of the neighborhood outside. There was a peaceful stability in those moments that I had never truly experienced before, because my life had always been filled with the weight of someone else's needs. Now for the first time my needs were allowed to matter. That realization felt like warmth spreading slowly through my chest with each passing day. Sometimes I would think about my childhood and how it shaped everything I grew into. I remember being the child who never complained and never asked for help even when I needed it. I remembered watching my parents show favoritism toward my sister in ways that felt subtle at first but grew more obvious as we got older. It was always her comfort, her feelings, her struggles that dictated the decisions in the house. I had been raised to believe that being responsible was my role, and that any desire I had for fairness or recognition was selfish. Looking back, I could see how deeply that message had been carved into me. The moment they demanded that I leave my own home had not been an isolated act. It had been the climax of a lifetime of conditioning. Seeing that truth clearly was painful, but it also gave me a sense of clarity that I desperately needed. It allowed me to finally understand that nothing I did could have changed them because the problem had never been my effort. The problem had been their inability to see me as someone deserving of equal love. There were nights when the quiet inside the house felt almost too loud. I would lie awake listening to the faint sounds of cars passing by in the distance, and I would feel a heavy sadness settle in my stomach. I wondered if my parents ever thought about me, or if they convinced themselves that I had wronged them by refusing to abandon the home I earned. I wondered if my sister still carried resentment or if she had already moved on to another source of help. These thoughts lingered like shadows that stretched across my mind. Yet even as they tried to pull me backward, I reminded myself that healing required letting go of the parts of my story that kept me stuck. I told myself that not every question needs an answer, and not every wound needs to be reopened. Some wounds are meant to teach us where we should never return. One day while cleaning the living room, I found an old photo album tucked behind a box. When I opened it, the faces of my younger self, my parents and my sister, stared back at me with bright smiles that felt distant and unreal. The photos captured moments of family outings and holidays and school events, but looking at them now, I could see the truth behind the smiles. I remembered how forced some of those moments felt. I remembered how often I stood slightly behind my sister because she always had to be the center. I remembered how my parents praised her loudly while telling me quietly that I should not expect the same recognition. Holding those photos, I felt a wave of grief wash over me. Grief for the childhood I wished I had. Grief for the love I never received. Grief for the years I spent believing I was the problem. I closed the album slowly and placed it aside, knowing that while those memories were a part of my story, they no longer controlled the direction of my life. As time passed, I began to notice something remarkable. The more I invested in myself, the more my world expanded in ways I never thought possible. I started taking walks in my neighborhood, each evening letting the gentle movement calm my restless thoughts. I watched children play in yards and couples walk their dogs and elderly neighbors watering plants on their porches. These simple scenes made me feel connected to the world again. I visited a local coffee shop more often, and eventually the barista began to recognize me, greeting me with a warm smile that felt genuine and reassuring. Small interactions like that reminded me that connection does not always come from family. Sometimes it comes from unexpected places and people who enter your life without demands or expectations. One evening while sitting on the porch, I allowed myself to imagine where my life might go next. I thought about the possibility of new experiences, new relationships, and new purposes. I felt a sense of hope rise inside me like a gentle tide. I realized that everything I had lost had made space for something better, something healthier, something that aligned with the person I was becoming. A soft breeze moved through the trees and I closed my eyes, letting it brush over me like a promise that the future would be kinder. I whispered to myself that I was ready for whatever came next. Ready to embrace a life built on strength instead of sacrifice. Ready to grow beyond the pain. Ready to live for myself. And in that moment, with the quiet night wrapped around me, I felt something I thought I would never feel again. Peace. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing that choosing myself was not only the right decision. It was the decision that saved me. The moral of this story is that sometimes the people we love the most can fail to see our worth, and it hurts in a way that feels heavy and personal, but their failure to recognize your value never erases the truth of who you are and what you have built with your own strength and sacrifice, because when you stand alone and fight for what is rightfully yours, you learn that your voice matters even if your family chooses not to hear it, and you learn that courage does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like holding your ground when everyone expects you to walk away. And this journey shows that self-respect is not something you ask permission for, it is something you claim because you earned it. And no one can take it from you, and the truth is that love should never require you to shrink or surrender what you have worked for. And real family does not demand that you give up your home or your peace for the comfort of someone else, because real family honors your effort and your history and your sacrifices even when they do not fully understand them. And the biggest lesson is that healing begins the moment you stop trying to make people see the truth and start choosing yourself with full confidence and full dignity. And you realize that protecting what is yours is not selfish, it is necessary, and your future will always open brighter doors when you choose honesty, integrity, and courage over silence, fear, and pressure. And this story reminds every person who has ever been overlooked or pushed aside that their strength is real, their journey is valid, and their voice deserves space. And in the end, the greatest victory is knowing you did not let anyone rewrite your truth or erase the life you built with your own hands.